The Save America Act sounds pretty simple. Prove you're a citizen, show an ID, and secure the vote. Sounds simple, right? But Donald Trump is selling it alongside a much bigger claim. And that's that China interfered in the 2020 election and intelligence officials buried the evidence. Look, foreign governments do target American politics. That part is real. What has never been shown, though, is that China, Venezuela, or anybody else for that matter, changed any votes or altered any outcomes. Here's the thing. When election security becomes a reason to distrust every result you dislike, the safeguard starts looking more like a political insurance policy. Today on Liberty Lens, we're going to try to separate the threat from the sales pitch. And here to help me do that is someone who is very interested in the way our elections are conducted, none other than current GOP vice presidential candidate, Mr. Mike Termont. Mike, how are you doing today?
Good to be with you, John. Great to be with you. As always, I'm fascinated by how you decide to describe the issue. And I must say, you blew my hair back a little bit. You went right to it, right? I thought you were going to soften up a little bit and, say we're going to talk about an array of issues that include, how we should be addressing election fraud, yada, yada. You went right to it, right to it. This is the tip of the spear. How do you sort out the difference between the stuff that we all agree on, which is we want our elections to be as secure as possible? We all agree that there are threats out there, both in the form of things that people have done, very small scale,
Right.
but things on a larger scale that bad people want to do to us, right?
Right.
And that's more concerning, I think. And at the same time, we have to differentiate between all of that and the political aspect. Obviously, this is an issue that has been politicized in some respects, politicized in a good, productive way, right? We all recognize that we might need tweaking to regulation, tweaking to legislation in order to make us as secure as possible. But, and I sense this in your question, there are some bad ways this has been politicized, exaggerations, and I would go so far as to argue that there has been some unnecessary diminution of our trust in our elections beyond what has been warranted.
You're absolutely right, Mike. And yes, I will grant you, I kind of like hit you with a bat swing there in my opening. Part of it is algorithmic. Of course, we want to let YouTube know what we're going to talk about right off the bat. But part of it is also that I wanted to frame it because our current, like, say, the last month or so, there's been this turning up of the rhetoric again from the president about election integrity and election denial. And it's been a little bit of both. And in my mind, there's a slight difference between the two, right? Election integrity issues are when the president comes out and says, like, hey, we gotta make sure everyone has an ID. We gotta make sure no non-citizens are casting votes. And at if the president were to stop there, Mike, I think he would have both of us on his side. As I think he would have most of the American public on his side. Would you agree?
It's wildly the idea that you should have to show an ID when you vote is wildly popular. Something like 80%, right? Something like 90% of Republicans and 70 or 80% of Democrats. No one wants to create a system in which it's easy for fraud. And I don't think that too many people believe that, showing an ID is all that hard.
Right. But I think you could take that, which is, to your point, wildly popular. And I think there have been someone like Thune has in the Senate has said, hey, strip out the rest of the SAVE Act and just leave it at that, and we'll be okay. But there's the
and it would pass.
And it would pass.
And as a reminder, to pass the Senate is going to require 60 out of 100 because this has nothing to do with the budget. So it requires 60 out of 100. And it would easily get 60 out of 100, particularly these days when the Democrats have been saying exactly that Thune is right. And if you stripped out the popular part, you'd really have something. The Democrats wouldn't be able to go back and say, well, we don't even like that piece,
Right,
right? You
right.
would easily get the 60 out of 100 you need.
So I think now that's now when the president keeps pressing and his messaging and his surrogates keep pressing, that's when they bring up election denialism again, which is the 2020 election was stolen. There have been attempts by foreign actors to influence elections both in 2020 and since 2020. And the timing of it is very suspect. Let's face it. For a group, and I'm talking to the president's base, that thrives on conspiracies, deep state actors, uh, a lot of these types of areas of conjecture. The concept that the president is talking about election denialism again ahead of midterm elections where he's widely projected, the GOP is widely projected to lose influence in these midterm elections. For example, the House is projected to go Democrat. The Senate is a toss up. The president is polling in the mid to high 30% range, all time lows for a president at this point of his administration. So, however, there doesn't seem to be this resistance to these denialist claims among the president's base. So can you talk to me a little bit about that,
Yeah,
Mike?
I think that we need to sort out a couple of things. And by we, I mean our party, the Republican Party. We need to separate out what happened in 2020 from this debate, right? If the debate is about the SAVE Act, if the debate is what are we going to do to make our elections more secure, and a piece of that debate is how insecure, how vulnerable are our elections, that's a debate to be had. That's a good conversation to have. We need to separate out the 2020 silliness, right? There is no such thing as a bunch of Republicans who have looked into 2020 and came away saying that what Trump supporters said in 2020 was correct, that Donald Trump really did win the election and it had been stolen. There is no credible analysis that backs that up.
Right.
Something like 60 some court cases were brought in federal court. They were all struck down. Many with prejudice, right? Many with nasty remarks from federal judges, many with nasty remarks from Republican appointed, including Trump appointed federal judges,
Let me
right?
jump in. In one case, the judge was so appalled at the nonsense that was alleged that he ordered the Trump lawyer to attend law classes for a certain period of time. That's how I wish I had the exact case, but that was one of the 64 cases you mentioned where the judge said, like, I am ordering you to take,
Yeah.
like, these remedial courses
And
again.
it's just because the way it was handled, you and I have said many times, the president has made the mistake of surrounding himself with nincompoops. And some of those nincompoops are people that were empowered to represent the president, the White House, the Republican Party, and represent his interests in federal court. And in my view, that was a mistake to send these people who just weren't very good at it into these courtroom situations and defend something for which they did not have the evidence, right? This was a political exercise that was mistakenly playing out in courts. And so it was not a good look. So we need to separate all of that out from the current debate. In my view, our party needs to draw a distinction between these two things. So, having said that, the president did have an address to the nation the other day, last week, right, in which he repeated some of the claims regarding 2020, but more importantly, brought up some of the real vulnerabilities in our system that we should be addressing, right? That the Chinese have an interest and even made a little bit of an effort. It appears to have been not very successful. That's good. But the fact that the Chinese have an interest in undermining our elections, That's a bad thing because the Chinese government, the Communist Party of China, is extremely big and powerful. And when they put their mind to it, they can do a lot of damage. And we have to make sure that they're not successful in the future. Having said that, the SAVE Act doesn't do that, right? The SAVE Act does not address the Chinese threat. So I think the right way to play this would be, as the majority leader in the Senate, John Thune, has said, to strip out the popular piece, which is to have people show voter ID, and then to add to that, perhaps in a different bill, but to add to that in some way some reinforcements. I don't know that you need, by the way, I'm told that you don't need federal legislation to do this. You might need a realignment of the resources that are already in place
Right, right.
to make our elections more secure. And for the benefit of all of our viewers, this is being done to the extent to which states can. States have made a great deal of progress in the form of making sure that control of the voting is not online, right? It isn't just a firewall you'd have to burn through. You would have to get to physical
Machines. That's
machines,
there's air gaps in the technology world. It's
air
called air.
gaps. Exactly right. You wouldn't be able to just hack your way into a state controlled federal election, and that's a good thing, right? That's a good thing. That's the way that we want it. There are further safeguards that would improve things, and we should do those things. As a states' rights guy and as a constitutionalist, I think that we have to recognize that this is the state's responsibility. But if there are things the federal government can do to help, then I don't think too many people would object. I mean, even a federalist like myself would say, well, if the federal government could help and there's some efficiency to the federal government helping, if they have certain expertise, if the NSA, for example, or the CIA or the Army, if any of these organizations had information that could help the states make it more secure, I think we would probably tolerate that, right? We would probably tolerate, even though the Constitution says that it's up to the states how these elections are run and controlled and administered and instituted. I think that we would probably tolerate a little bit of federal government help, but that's not the same thing as a federal government takeover. It's not the same thing as the SAVE Act, which doesn't help against these threats.
Right,
But at the end of the day, you gotta separate these things into the two different debates.
right.
This debate is not assisted by revisiting 2020.
Agreed. And I think it's important. You touched on a lot of subjects there, Mike, and good for you. But I want to sort of tease out individual things, and I want you to give me your ideas on that. So the first thing is the actual evidence that you mentioned, right? So I'm going to toss aside anything that Republicans would consider to be lib created, leftist propaganda, or any of that nonsense. So I'm leaving that aside.
And there is nonsense there.
Right. And absolutely there is.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But let me give three, in my opinion, unimpeachable Republican slash conservative sources and what they had to say about election fraud. The Cato Institute, a longtime right wing slash libertarian think tank, did a study of a 20-year period from 2003 to 2023. They concluded no systemic fraud. As a matter of fact, under the most generous of cases, they cited the Heritage Foundation. Heritage Foundation, famously a Republican conservative think tank. They're the authors of Project 2020, what was it, 2025? The infamous, in some ways, blueprint of the Trump administration. The Heritage Foundation concluded a study over 20 years as well. They only found 99 cases of fraud in 20 years. Not 99 cases where, say, 10,000 ballots were involved. They found 99 cases of an individual vote in each case being improperly cast. Think about that. On average, nationally, 5 votes a year over a 20-year period. There was a conservative study conducted by 8 notable Republican and conservative figures, among them Ted Olson, the former Solicitor General, 2 former U.S. Republican senators, Danforth and who was the other one? Former Oregon Republican senator. I don't remember his name right now. Sorry. Several federal judges appointed by Bush, Reagan, and Trump himself. They all concluded that the 2020 election fraud, they did it specifically for 2020, those allegations were all nonsense. Nothing could be proven. And the title of their study was Lost, Not Stolen. So
Yep.
when the president starts citing that, hey, there's been all these cases and people are ignoring the evidence, and why won't anybody listen to me? 2020 was stolen. That's something the president has maintained, Mike, from day one. So,
Yep.
given this preponderance of evidence, tell me, what do you think is going on here?
The preponderance of evidence not only suggests that there was not widespread fraud, certainly not of the scale that would matter to election outcomes, but the preponderance of evidence suggests that everyone knows this, right? Everybody in the Republican Party who has the resources to turn over any rock knows that this is the case. As a matter of fact, President Trump knows that there was not sufficient widespread fraud to justify a claim that he won the 2020 election. He knows this. So, and the preponderance of evidence suggests this. This is not, Mike's assertion. The president knows that this is a political exercise. So the question becomes, how come, and is this a worthwhile political exercise? And I think the jury is still out on that, and I think that we will see what we will see, and we won't see what we won't see. But it is concerning from a couple of different angles. One is a political one. Is this a good idea for our party? Is this a good idea for the Republican Party for us to be out there saying the 2020 election was stolen? Not too many Republican politicians say that anymore. Very few actually say that, but a whole bunch of Republican politicians go along with it, right? Don't contradict it. Is that a good look? Now, I would argue, no, it's not. It's not a good look because the American public knows that it's not true, right? But more importantly, it's a distraction from what is true and therefore what is more important, right? Every Republican consultant in America today is saying that our party needs to focus on things like inflation, getting costs down, making the world more affordable, especially housing, creating more opportunity to get ahead, boosting the robust growth of our economy, getting out of the war as quickly as possible so that prices come down, especially for oil, and the world becomes more affordable and economically more viable, right? That's what we need to be focusing on.
Right, right,
And to the extent to which we're focused on even the SAVE Act, much less voter fraud, it's a distraction. And that's a problem for us politically. I'm just making the political case at the moment.
right, right.
Never mind right and wrong.
Right. So the politically, I think you've hit a good sort of position there. I agree with you. But let me throw in constitutionally, because I think I don't hear enough of this being mentioned. In our Constitution, elections are almost completely under the control of each individual state. That's the way the founders wanted it. That's what they envisioned. When the when electoral votes are counted in Congress and the vice president certifies, say, a presidential election, that's pro forma. That's not that they are there to decide whether there was any fraud going on or anything. The vice president is just certifying every state. I received my electoral ballots from every state. That's what he's certifying.
Right. His job is to use the abacus,
Mm.
right?
Literally
His
just, yeah,
just count them up. Just open the envelopes,
right,
and add the electoral votes up.
right,
That's your job. Your job is not supposed to be thinking about this.
right. And if you think about it, whether it was intended or not by the founders, and I think it was, the genius of that is, in terms of election fraud or foreign influence in, say, presidential elections, Mike, the genius of that is you would have to, if you're a foreign agent, you would have to assert fraud and control over more than one point. In other words, you have 50 states now you would have to exercise fraud in more than one point of access in order to influence an election to a significant amount. Now, you could argue it could be two or three swing states, or but it's more than one point. Certainly, it would be more difficult than if the federal government centralized, nationalized elections, as the president has always wanted to do. I mean,
Well,
I
that
don't.
is an important point, and it's a good point from the standpoint of security and the apparatus, the institution, how it works. That's a very important point. And to your point, there's another aspect of this, which is we don't want a national election. We don't have a national election in this country. There's no such thing as a national election in America. Our federal elections are conglomerations of state administered elections to send electoral votes, right, to the federal government. It is not uh, a national election that takes place in 50 different places. These are 50 different elections to decide how each state's electoral votes are to be cast. This is a very different thing. And the reason that this is philosophically important is because correctly perceived, which is not always the case popularly, popularly, is not always correctly perceived, but correctly perceived, our federal government is a creature of states, is a creature of state governments, is a creature that governs by the consent of the states, not only in terms of the state's population, but the state's government. And the states, therefore, electoral institutions. We do not want the national government trying to play a role in each of these elections. It's just philosophically backwards. And that's why we need to be careful regarding how much we tolerate a federal government even playing a role in assisting, because we certainly don't want the federal government influencing or controlling. In fact, it used to be, John, that if the federal government wanted to go so far as play a significant role in securing these elections, 100 years ago, that would have been considered foreign influence, right? That would have itself been considered foreign influence inside each state. How far we have fallen from federalism truly correctly perceived. But having said that, like I said before, we would probably tolerate some today just from a technical point of view. But yes, to your point, we make the elections more secure by keeping them separate from each other.
Right. And I think folks don't appreciate, in say popular view, how important this is. Because if you think about it, every totalitarian nation, every monarchy, every dictatorship starts with who's in charge of counting the ballots and who's in
Yes.
charge of declaring a winner. Look, in the old days of Tammany Hall, what was it that Boss Tweed famously said? It doesn't. It's not how many ballots are cast; it's who counts the ballots, or something to that effect. Like even back then,
Yeah.
in corrupt Tammany Hall in New York, they understood that you got to get to the ballot counters, right? You got to control the people who tally the votes more so.
And the next step up is controlling whether there's an election at all.
That's the point I wanted to bring up.
Mr. Ortega said yesterday in Nicaragua, we're not going to have elections anymore.
Well, interestingly,
That's quite a statement.
sure it is, Mike, and interestingly enough, there was a U.S. leader who openly uh, stated something similar. President Trump. Now, afterwards, the spin was that he was just joking. But in an interview, President Trump very clearly said, I'm starting to wonder if we even need an election anymore, or maybe we should cancel the election. President Trump is on video having said this. Now, of course, the little blonde girl at the podium claimed he was just joking and people shouldn't take things seriously. I mean, why would you, from the leader of the free world? Why would you take what he says seriously? But
We all do believe that he didn't mean to say it,
Perfect. Yes, I don't think he meant to say
right?
it out loud. You're right.
And he, you know, if 50, he probably didn't mean it. He probably doesn't even want it, but you know, we don't know that with a great deal of certainty, which is why it's important that our leaders speak with clarity. And one of the things that we worry about, John, is that if the president is wishy-washy on this, even even if it's joking, even if it's sarcasm, even if it's exaggeration, right? Let's assume that for the moment, because otherwise it's a weird world in which we're living. Let's assume that it's exaggeration and joking and sarcasm, blah blah blah. To the extent to which he's wishy-washy, that wishy-washiness feeds the narrative of Americans wondering why he's doubling down on the SAVE Act after it has become clear that the Senate votes aren't there. Let me be clear about this. The president was very much pro SAVE Act, very much in favor of passing this legislation all along. But once it became clear that the votes weren't there, not even close, right? Not even close. The typical political playbook in this country has traditionally been, at that point, the president needs to decide, am I close enough that if I double down, I can get a couple of more votes, push it over the line? And really, that should be handled quietly. You don't want to put the White House reputation on the
That's
line
the
over it,
classic
right?
backroom deal.
That's the classic backroom deal. The president makes phone calls to 15 senators who he thinks are on the bubble and might, have a conversation, says, what's it going to take for me to get
And
your
even
vote?
that's a Herculean task to get 15 senators. Typically, something like that, the backslapping and stuff is for two or three tops, where you're like, you get a
That's
yeah,
right. Well, that's a good point. If you needed two or three, you would call 15 in the hope of getting two or three, and Lord knows what you would have to promise them, right? And you would not want that to be in full view in public. So that's strategy A. Strategy B is arguably the more popular, traditionally speaking, which is walk away from it. It was never that important to me, or now that we know the votes aren't there, we're going to move on to something that we can accomplish. For example, the housing bill that the Republican Senate had passed and believes that it would be politically good for our party to be seen as reducing barriers to
which,
home
by the way,
ownership.
to your point, the president refused to sign. He just let it become law through inaction because the Senate refused to pass the SAVE Act. So he not only did he not walk away
Right.
from it, he very verbally doubled down on the fact that, we're not doing anything until this.
Okay. So perfect. So this is my point. He was not following strategy B of walking away from the SAVE Act, and he was not following strategy A of quietly cajoling a bunch of senators until he got the two votes he needed, because it wasn't two votes that he needs. It's something like 10 or 12, right? And almost all from Democrats. That's a lift. As a matter of fact, let me be more clear. That's not possible. It's not. There isn't anything that the president could offer that would sway 12 out of 48 Democratic senators to vote for the SAVE Act. It just can't happen. Okay, so why choose strategy C, which has virtually, I don't want to say never, but virtually never been seen before, which is double down on something that's impossible and do so even in louder fashion than the noise made before it became clear that he didn't have the votes, right? Like now it's even more important to support it publicly, and to do so at the expense of something in our party's favor, the housing bill. In other words, he refused to support the housing bill in a full-throated fashion because he was busy doubling down on the SAVE Act. Why? Why would you double down on something that's impossible instead of and at the expense of something that was politically expedient? And the answer can only be that he wants this issue, right? He wants this issue. Why would he want this issue? Well, because the midterm election is coming. The midterm election is coming, and to your point, it is widely perceived that the Republicans are going to lose control of the House. I believe I'm the last person in America who believes the Republicans have a chance. We can still pull this out if we get on message. That's a huge if, and we don't appear to be doing it. So it looks like, my statement has no value at all because it's contingent on us getting on message, and our party just refuses to get on message. So it looks like we're in trouble in terms of controlling the House. If the midterm election is coming and it looks like we're about to lose control of the House, the president is doubling down on this issue because he wants the political cover of being able to say the midterm election was not all that important because it swims in a world in which the SAVE Act was not passed.
I agree with you, Mike. That certainly from an excuse perspective, I agree with you. But if you were to take someone who's even wildly more conspiratorial, say myself in this case, I would say that the SAVE Act serves as an insurance policy, not just politically, but functionally. Meaning that it's not just cover if the SAVE Act were to be passed, and in essence, the greater nationalization of our elections, then come to 2028, whether Trump thinks he can run for a third term somehow, as Steve Bannon and Peter Thiel seem to think there's a constitutional possibility of that, whether it's Trump seeking a third term, whether it's Vance, whether it's Rubio or whoever, we've already seen that the president in 2020 is willing to try every constitutional theory to retain power, going so far as to demand that Mike Pence not certify an election. We already talked about that. It was just a pro forma thing. Somehow they concluded Pence could overturn the results of the state ballots, or not accept them, I should say. To someone like me, Mike, who's always on the lookout for dictators and authoritarians and people who want to run my life, why would I think the president is up to anything other than setting up an insurance policy for himself through the flowery, supposedly well-intentioned SAVE Act? Because it's one of those things that if someone were to come to me and say, hey, Big John, what's the matter with you? What do you want? You want illegals voting? You want people voting 10 times because there's no ID required? What's the matter with you? It's common sense, isn't it?
The answer is, John, because the president's rhetoric went up, not down, when it was revealed he didn't have the votes. In other words, if he wanted the SAVE Act, and he probably did want the SAVE Act, right? But if it were only a matter of he wants the SAVE Act in case he needs to federalize elections and do something nefarious, if that were the case, if that's what this were all about, he would have been much more vociferous before finding out that he didn't have the votes. His doubling, tripling down, the national speech the other night, right? All of this came after it became clear that it couldn't possibly pass.
But Mike, let me ask you something.
Which
Yeah, go ahead.
suggests that there's huge value in the issue for the president, even if it doesn't pass. But he needs to garner that value now by raising the profile of being on the losing side of the issue. In other words, I think you're correct that there's an insurance policy here, but I believe it to be a political one.
Let's assume that I follow your thinking on this, because I agree there is political cover to making these outlandish claims. I agree with you, and I think we see it because in several congressional hearings, you hear, or Senate hearings, you'll hear the witnesses. They'll be asked, like, did Joe Biden win the 2020 election? And they all had the exact same answer, word for word. I believe that Joe Biden was certified the president of the 2020 election. Word for word.
Right.
So clearly, it wasn't like someone came to a legal opinion, right? They were all given this by the administration.
And that's a political exercise, not a
Exactly.
legal one.
That's a political exercise because their statement was technically true, but at the same time, they're not contradicting the president's claims of a stolen election, right? So it was a very
I think that this is all part of a political exercise to diminish the political fallout, the blame that would accrue to the White House, to the administration, to the president himself, if inevitably it comes to pass that we lose the House. If we, the Republican Party, loses control of the House, there's going to be enormous political blame, plenty to go around. But a large piece of it, I don't know how large, but a large piece of it will adhere to the president. And I believe that the reason he is complaining about not having the SAVE Act is so that he'll be able to say, well, certain things were done. If they were done differently, as I told you, if they were done differently, as I told you, we wouldn't be in this situation. It's not my fault. It's your fault for not listening to me.
I hear you, and I could see where there's that again is a very populist political argument, and perhaps I would employ that as well if I was messaging. However, I have to point out certain things only because I have to. Uh, First, the president has gotten a lot of what he wanted as political insurance on a very technical level. For example, all the gerrymandering that, let's be honest, while gerrymandering has always existed, and I'm not going to claim otherwise, and I'll even use the both sides argument because I think it's applicable in this case. The gerrymandering frenzy that was kicked off since he took office was kicked off by the Republicans, by the president specifically.
Yep.
The mid cycle gerrymandering instead of the traditional when the census came out type of thing,
Yep.
right?
Yep. And your point is that's something you would do if you weren't just looking for political cover, but you were looking for political firepower so that you didn't lose the House in the first place.
I think his analysts have from day one were saying you're already in trouble, start working on it. And so I get it. That was one thing. The second thing was his personal pull in key primaries on the Republican side. The most notable one was
Yep.
Thomas Massie. And as a matter of
Right.
fact, Massie, there's nothing more dangerous than a man with nothing left to lose. Uh, Massie, I just saw an interview with him, and he said, why are the Republicans focusing on election fraud? We won the House, we won the Senate, we won the White House. In many ways, we won the Supreme Court. There is no one left to stand against our agenda if we actually implemented our agenda. And to your earlier point, why aren't we ending the war in Iran? Why aren't we addressing inflation? Why aren't we doing this? What about the Epstein files? The whole nine yards. So I think there
Yep.
is that sort of thing that it kind of makes me wonder. You've done all these other things, and to do this now, I think you're still on a sinking ship. That's the first thing. And then the second thing I'll throw in, which is my pop psychoanalysis of the president, which is look, it's well known the president is a big believer, the power of positive thinking, the whole Norman Vincent Peale thing. And if you read that book, which I think is a good book by Haberman and Swan, the president at many times goes against the advice, the almost unanimous consent advice of his closest advisors, people that he respects and likes, because, quote, he just knows things will work out for him. He's a big believer in the power of positive thinking. How much of this do you think is related to that, where the president says, I don't care how many chambers I have. I just know that when I want something done, if I believe it'll get done, it'll get done. And how much of that do you think is the president sort of divorcing himself from the best advice he might be getting from his inner circle? I mean, I think to me, it's a little baffling, Mike.
I get that, and I don't want to suggest that that's impossible or that it's of zero influence. I just think that one's analysis of whether one can carry the Senate is different from one's analysis as to whether or not you can carry an election. In other words, it's much easier to be really optimistic about an election than it is to say 25% of Democratic senators are going to suddenly change their minds because you went on TV or because you said, that's like 2 and 2 is 5 kind of stuff. The president isn't that dumb.
What about the concept of the bully pulpit, though? Do you think Trump still believes in that?
No, not to that extent. The Trump the Trump playbook is use the pulpit to convince everybody, not to get the votes that he needs. And that's why the White House doesn't go to the legislature very often, right? That's why they use executive orders because they know they can't get the votes. And I go back to if this was just a matter of if I scream loud enough, I'll get my way in the Senate, he would have been screaming louder 6 weeks ago. But he wasn't. That's the tell. For me, that's the tell. That when it was still possible, he didn't make as much noise as he is after it became impossible. And that tells me that he really wants this issue. And that's consistent with seeking political cover for a shellacking in November. In other words, I think I'm much more optimistic than the president is. I'm the one who says, we can still pull this out if we get on message. And I'm beginning to look like an idiot, right? Because I'm the last one in America who thinks either our party can get on message, right? Or that we will, or that'll cause us to hang on to the House. I still think it's July 20 something now. We're running up against it. So I'm about to look like a loser, I'm afraid. But I still believe that if we got on message and stopped talking about silly and unimportant things, and in some cases, things that aren't even true, I think that we would have at least a shot at it. I saw recent data that shows that the Democrats are up in a generic Democrat versus Republican congressional race by only 4 points nationally.
Still stunning to me that it's only a 4-point margin.
That may be. I was surprised too, which is why it's stuck in my brain.
Yeah.
And the analysis says that they need to be up by 3 points to carry the House. This was CNN's analysis. Could be wrong, right? I just throw this
Right.
out there as a point that it's pretty close.
Right.
That if we were to, according to CNN, if we were to get that down from Democrats +4 to Democrats +2, we could hang on to the House. That's the CNN analysis, and they hate our guts. So I still think that it's possible. And I get the impression that the president doesn't think that it's still possible to hang on to the House, which is why he's creating all of this cover for him to say things like, well, you shouldn't pass the SAVE Act like I told you.
Right.
Right. And he doesn't do other things that you would do to save lowercase s, to save the House, right? If you thought you were close and you could hang on to the House of Representatives, you would not have gone after Thomas Massie.
Probably not.
Because going after Massie diminished, only a little perhaps, but slightly diminished your chances of hanging on to that seat. And it cost you dozens of millions of dollars you could have spent on other seats. It's not a strategy you would have picked if you thought you were cutting it close and you needed to hang on to that seat and you needed the money to hang on to some other seats. He's playing this like someone who expects to lose in November.
How much of that messaging of the president's, I'm Mike, we say it every week, but I'm still fascinated by this. How much of this is the president, do you feel, going off script? I can't imagine that even in a room full of sycophants, and I'm not saying that's what's happening, but I'm putting him in the scenario where he's being advised by
There's no one to agree with him.
right. Like, in what world are these, to what even other Republicans seem like unhinged comments, unhinged rants about our election system? Do you think the president is going off script? Again, I can't seem to think his speechwriter is sitting down and saying, "Yeah, let's talk about this."
I don't think. I think you and I are still living in the previous decade,
Okay.
where there were such things as scripts
Okay.
and things like speech
All
writers.
right.
And I think that if the teleprompter told him to say something he didn't like, he would just disregard it. I really don't think that he's one of these guys who just says whatever the teleprompter says. He's the opposite
Of Ron Burgundy.
of
Ron Burgundy. Yeah.
he's the opposite of Ron Burgundy, right? The teleprompter could tell you to say something smart, and he'd be like, "No, I'm not saying that." He's just physically allergic to saying things like, "Gee, we need, at some point we need to realize that we have exhausted all the analysis that we can bring to bear on the 2020 election, and we're going to have to move on." There is no teleprompter in the world that could extract those words from the president's mouth, right? So, as much as it's true, and you and I complain that he's surrounded by dinglings, at some point he's going to have to take responsibility for this strategy. And I think that this is his strategy. I think he's looking for political cover because he believes that he's going to lose in November. And whether the president means now we have to now we have to get into an area that you would characterize as psychology, right? And I agree with you. We don't really know what the president is thinking. But at some point, we're going to have to figure out the following. To what extent does the president recognize that his political cover, and all politicians do this, right? I can't single out so many politicians, Democrats and Republicans, past, present, and unfortunately probably future, do stupid things. They say stupid things to give themselves political cover, right? When I ran for Congress 5 or 6 years ago now, there was someone, I'm not going to name names, but there's someone in the race who got shellacked, other than me, someone who got shellacked and immediately said that there was voter fraud. No evidence. He just looked at the results and said, "Oh, that number can't possibly reflect reality." And I'm looking at my number like, "You think yours is bad, right?" But at the end of the day, you've got to be a grown ass adult and recognize that sometimes people don't vote for you. And you can politicians have said stupid things like, "I'm smarter than the electorate," right? People, maybe not with those words, but they have certainly suggested it. Mitt Romney and Hillary Clinton have said things that would curl our hair about how much smarter they are than the general electorate. I don't think it's true, by the way. I don't think that Mitt and Hillary are smarter than the general electorate, but
They thought they were.
they certainly thought they were, not each other, but themselves, right? And so there are all kinds of politicians who say stupid things. But we're going to have to figure out at some point, does the president know? Does he recognize that what he's saying is undermining our faith in the elections?
That's, I think, a very key point. Like, yeah.
Right. Does he know? Because I think it is, right? I think it is undermining our faith in the elections. I think that causing a reduction in Americans' faith in our elections without sufficient cause, without evidence, is a form of election fraud, and an unpatriotic one at that.
So let me just restate that for you, or at least ask you to expand on that, because I think that's a great point that bears repeating and bears like being crystal clear on. That casting doubt on the integrity of our electoral system without any proof, and to do so repeatedly, you're saying, is in itself a form of election fraud. Is that correct?
Yes, if we if you are without evidence, if you are without a basis for claiming election fraud, and you do it anyway in a fashion that reduces Americans' faith in our electoral processes and institutions, that is itself a form of election fraud. And I think it's unpatriotic. I think it's unhelpful. I think it undermines our political process, and I think that we got to cut it out. Do I know if there's anyone who's doing that? No, I don't know that with any certainty, right? But to the extent to which the White House is aware that it's reducing Americans' faith in our elections, then it needs to look itself in the mirror and say, we got to cut it out. And we need to have a way of communicating with each other in a fashion that helps each other cut it out. And I believe that the Republican Party needs to play a role in this, right? The Republican Party needs to play a role in enhancing our faith in our electoral system. And that means recognizing that the 2020 election was lost and not stolen. It means stepping up uh, outside of the SAVE Act that does not do anything to protect us from the Chinese government and make the changes necessary to protect our systems and move forward in a way that brings the technology to bear that makes Americans feel good about our elections because they are secure and they are the bedrock of our democracy.
Well said, Mike. I was going to throw an anecdote or two about William F. Buckley and getting elected, but I will skip that in lieu of that was the perfect summation of what we were talking about. Thank you for that. All right, everyone, you've been watching Liberty Lens. As always, hit the subscribe button, smash the like button. It helps us out. And Mike, before we go, as always, I'm going to give you the opportunity to tell people about your quest to become the VP nominee of the Republican Party in 2028.
Well, I appreciate that. There is a dovetail here, right? I am seeking the Republican Party's nomination for vice president, and for two big reasons. One is because I believe that a member of the Liberty Movement needs to be on the national ticket to unify the Republican Party and to make us as competitive as possible in 2028. The other reason is because I believe that we need a more legitimate and more democratic process behind the nomination of whoever is the vice president, whoever is the Republican Party's vice presidential nominee in 2028 and going forward. And the reason for that is because I just think that the way it's done now is dumb, right? The idea of allowing one individual to choose, it lacks transparency, it lacks legitimacy. There's no public vetting process. You don't always get the A team, and most importantly, once the vice president is in office, he or she, in Kamala's situation, feels completely politically beholden to a grand total of one person. And I don't want any more future situations, nor does anyone else want any future situations that look like the Kamala Harris situation, where all of a sudden, 3 years later, we realize that was really important, right? Maybe we should have had the entire party weigh in. I would like to see all of the national delegates weigh in and have a floor vote at the National Convention in 2028 for the party to select the vice presidential nominee, not merely one individual. Think how much stronger, if you're a Democrat and you love yourself some Kamala Harris, not my thing, but you do you. Think how much happier you would have been a couple of years ago if there had been a robust public vetting, an important process surrounding the selection of Kamala Harris as VP and as the presidential nominee. Both those things would have been terrific. And by the way, fellow Republicans, if some of you out there are big JD Vance fans, right? Good for you. Think how much more JD Vance you would be getting today if we had a legitimate democratic process by which the entirety of the Republican Party had weighed in the form of votes from our national delegates to support the vice president rather than just one individual picking him. And I think that, it's all well and good to say, well, we're all happy with JD Vance today, and a lot of Republicans are, right? Good for you. I get that. But what happens in the future? And by the way, what happens in, upon your review of the past. You're going to tell me that you're happy with every single vice presidential nominee that the Republican Party came up with by virtue of having one guy make that pick. I'm not going to name names, but you cannot tell me that we've always had the A team. And
At the
part of
very least, you would have gotten somebody who could spell potato once upon a
the don't pick on my guy. Don't pick on my
time.
guy.
Look that up, folks. But if you kind of are down with what Mike is saying, please go to MikeTermott.com. Check out what Mike has to say. Find out ways you can help. Find out ways you can get more information. Go to MikeTermott.com. It's right there on the screen.
And feel free to reach out to me at mike@miketermott.com. Start
How
a
many
dialogue.
candidates are giving out their personal email address so you can cajole them and interact with them? Yes, send him a note, mike@miketermott.com, or again, just go to the website, miketermott.com. It's right there on the screen for you. Okay, everyone. Once again, thank you for joining us for this episode of Liberty Lands. Please like and subscribe. Until next time, for my co host, Mr. Mike Termott, and myself, peace, everyone.